"You know you're not my first choice, right?" She smirked, so I calmly said, and disappeared. 4 years later, I'm married with a baby, and she's alone texting me about how she made the biggest mistake of her life. The smell of wood stain and Rachel's lavender shampoo used to mean weekend mornings in our garage, working side by side on whatever piece of vintage furniture we'd rescued from an estate sale. I was working as a warehouse supervisor in Sacramento while studying for my logistics certification at night, and she was a marketing coordinator bouncing between different tech startups, always chasing the next big opportunity in San Francisco. Our duplex wasn't much to look at from the outside, but we'd spent weekends at estate sales and antique shops, finding pieces with good bones that we could restore together. I'd strip the old paint while she researched period-appropriate colors, and we'd work side by side refinishing a 1940s dining table or reupholstering a mid-century armchair we'd found for $20. The living room had this warm, collected-over-time feel that you can't buy in a furniture store, every piece representing a shared Saturday morning discovery and hours of work together. When Rachel started getting invited to more networking events and industry conferences in the Bay Area, I was genuinely proud of her ambition and wanted to support it however I could. I'd drive her to events when her car was acting up, sit in coffee shops editing her portfolio presentations while she networked, and even picked up extra weekend shifts at the warehouse to help pay for the professional development courses she wanted to take. "You're going to make it big," I tell her when she'd come home frustrated about missing out on some opportunity, and I meant it. She had this drive and vision that I admired, this ability to see possibilities where I just saw problems to solve. I thought we were a team, that my steady income and practical support gave her the freedom to chase her dreams, and that eventually we'd both benefit when those dreams paid off. Looking back, maybe I should have paid more attention to how she started talking about her colleagues' boyfriends, the software engineers and startup founders who drove luxury cars and lived in those glass high-rises overlooking the bay. But I was focused on my own goals too, working toward that logistics certification that would open up management opportunities, and I figured her occasional comments about different lifestyles were just observations, not comparisons. We had plans to get married once we were both more established, had talked about buying a house with a bigger garage where I could set up a proper workshop and she could have a home office. The duplex was supposed to be temporary, but it had become home in a way that felt permanent and real. I loved coming back from long shifts to find her working at our restored oak desk, surrounded by marketing materials and color swatches, completely absorbed in whatever project she was passionate about that week. It felt like we were building towards something bigger together, that all the small sacrifices and shared efforts were investments in a future that would be worth the wait. The shift started so gradually I almost missed it, like watching paint fade in sunlight. Rachel began making these little comments about my blue-collar mindset whenever I'd suggest practical solutions to her work problems, rolling her eyes when I'd mention wanting to expand my skills in supply chain management instead of pivoting to tech like everyone else. "Jake, you think like someone who fixes things instead of someone who creates them," she'd say, and at first I thought she was just processing stress from her increasingly competitive industry. Her networking events started yielding actual connections, and suddenly our conversations were peppered with stories about colleagues' boyfriends who were software engineers at Google, startup founders with venture capital backing, guys who lived in those converted lofts in Soma and drove cars that cost more than my annual salary. "Marcus just bought his girlfriend a weekend trip to Napa for her birthday," she'd mention casually while I was balancing our checkbook, "and they've only been dating 8 months. I'd nod and ask if she wanted to plan a camping trip to Yosemite, which apparently wasn't the same thing at all. Everything changed when she met Harper at a tech mixer in Palo Alto, some exclusive networking event Rachel had gotten invited to through a startup she was consulting for. Harper was this successful interior designer who flipped luxury properties in Marin County, drove a white Tesla, and had the kind of Instagram account that looked like a magazine spread of perfectly curated spaces and artisanal coffee cups. "She really gets design in a way that's more sophisticated than what we've been doing," Rachel explained after their first meeting, gesturing at our carefully restored living room like it was suddenly amateur hour. "Harper thinks I have real potential in residential staging if I could just expand my vision beyond, antique shop finds." Within weeks, Rachel was spending entire weekends at Harper's design studio in Sausalito, claiming they were collaborating on projects that always seemed to require Saturday planning sessions and Sunday site visits to properties I was never invited to see. She'd come home Sunday evenings with her hair smelling like expensive perfume and her eyes bright with the kind of excitement I hadn't seen since our early days refinishing furniture together, except now that excitement had nothing to do with me. "Harper really understands my creative vision," became Rachel's favorite phrase, usually delivered while she scrolled through Harper's social media posts of minimalist beach houses and industrial loft conversions. "She thinks I've been limiting myself by staying in tech marketing when I could be doing something more artistic and meaningful." The promise ring I'd given her for our 5th anniversary, a simple vintage piece we'd found at an estate sale and had resized together, disappeared from her fingers sometime in October. When I asked about it, she said it was getting in the way while she worked on design projects, that rings were impractical when you were handling fabric samples and paint swatches all day. She started dressing differently too, trading her comfortable jeans and vintage band t-shirts for the kind of flowing, expensive-looking pieces that Harper wore in her Instagram stories, neutral colors and interesting textures that cost 3 times what we usually spent on clothes. It's about presenting yourself professionally, Rachel explained when I mentioned the new wardrobe. Harper says image matters more in design than it does in tech marketing. I told myself this was just Rachel growing more confident in her career, finding her artistic voice, expanding her horizons in ways that would ultimately benefit both of us. After all, I'd always supported her ambitions, and if Harper was helping her discover new talents and opportunities, wasn't that a good thing? But watching her scroll through Harper's Instagram with that dreamy expression, listening to her talk about Harper's sophisticated taste and business acumen, I started feeling like a placeholder in my own relationship, like I was the reliable backup plan while she explored more exciting possibilities. I came home from a double shift that Friday evening expecting to find Rachel curled up on our restored velvet couch with her laptop, maybe planning another weekend trip to Harper's studio, but instead I walked into what looked like the aftermath of a very expensive shopping spree. Designer clothes I'd never seen before were laid out across our bed in neat piles, and Rachel was methodically folding them into 2 pieces of luggage that definitely hadn't come from our usual discount stores. The suitcases themselves looked like they cost more than my monthly truck payment, all sleek lines and premium leather with those gold-toned hardware details that scream serious money. Going somewhere? I asked, setting my work boots by the door and trying to process the scene, because this looked less like a weekend trip and more like someone moving out permanently. Rachel didn't even look up from the silk blouse she was folding with the kind of care usually reserved for museum artifacts. Actually, I'm moving in with Harper. The words hit like cold water, delivered in the same tone she might use to mention picking up groceries, and I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Moving in with Harper, I repeated, because sometimes saying something out loud helps your brain catch up to reality, and the reality was apparently that my girlfriend of 6 years was packing designer clothes I'd never seen her wear to go live with someone else. We've been together for months now, Rachel continued, still focused on her packing like this was the most natural conversation in the world, and it just makes sense to take the next step. Harper's offering me a full partnership in the design business, plus her place in Sausalito has this incredible view of the bay and actual space for me to work on my projects. The casual way she mentioned being together for months, like it was a minor detail she'd forgotten to share, made something cold settle in my stomach. Months? I said, and it wasn't really a question because the timeline was already arranging itself in my head, all those weekend trips and late-night phone calls and the gradual distance that I'd attributed to career stress suddenly making perfect sense. Rachel finally looked up at me then, and her expression was almost pitying, like I was a slow student who'd finally grasped a concept everyone else had understood from the beginning. You know you're not my first choice, right? She said, and the matter-of-fact tone made it somehow worse than if she'd been cruel about it. I mean, you're sweet and you've been incredibly supportive, but let's be honest about what this has always been. I felt like someone had punched all the air out of my lungs, but I managed to ask, what has this always been, Rachel? She sat down on the edge of our bed, surrounded by her expensive new wardrobe, and looked at me with something that might have been fondness if it wasn't so condescending. You've been my safety net, Jake. The reliable option while I figured out what I actually wanted from life. And now I know. The word, safety net, echoed in my head like a slap, reducing 6 years of shared dreams and weekend mornings and quiet evenings planning our future to something purely functional, like car insurance or a savings account. What about our plans? I asked, thinking about the house we'd talked about buying, the workshop I wanted to build, the life we'd been slowly constructing piece by piece. What about the 6 years we've spent together? Rachel's laugh was soft and genuinely amused, like I'd made a charming but naive observation. Jake, those weren't really plans, they were just comfortable fantasies. Harper can offer me things you never could, real financial security, creative opportunities, a lifestyle that actually matches my potential instead of limiting it. She gestured around our duplex, at the furniture we'd restored together and the life we'd built, like it was evidence of some fundamental failure on my part. You're fine for practice, but you're not for the real thing. Harper understands that I need someone who can match my ambitions, not someone who thinks a camping trip to Yosemite is the height of romance. The words, fine for practice, landed like physical blows, each syllable designed to make me feel smaller, less significant, like I'd been auditioning for a role I was never going to get. I looked at this woman I'd loved for 6 years, who'd let me support her dreams and pay for her professional development courses and drive her to networking events, and realized I was looking at a complete stranger. So that's it, I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. 6 years and I was just practice. Rachel stood up and resumed her packing, her movements quick and efficient like she was eager to get this conversation over with. Don't be dramatic, Jake. It's not like this is a surprise, we've been growing apart for months. I've outgrown what we had here, and you have to admit that what Harper and I have is more exciting, more real than anything you and I ever managed to build. I watched her fold a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than I made in a week, and something clicked into place. This wasn't a sudden decision or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated exit strategy that had been months in the making, complete with a new wardrobe and a better offer. Rachel had been planning her upgrade while I'd been planning our future, and the only surprise was that it had taken me this long to see it. Okay, I said, and walked out to my truck without another word. I heard Rachel calling after me as I reached the front door, something about not being dramatic and needing to have an adult conversation about this, but I kept walking because there wasn't anything left to discuss. She'd made her choice months ago, and I wasn't about to stand there begging someone to reconsider a decision they'd already celebrated by buying designer luggage. My hands were steady as I started the engine, which surprised me because inside I felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to everything I thought I knew about my life. I drove to my brother Marcus's place in Stockton without really deciding to, just pointing the truck east and letting muscle memory take over while my brain tried to catch up to what had just happened. Marcus took one look at my face when he opened the door and grabbed 2 beers from the fridge without asking any questions, which is why he's always been my favorite person to talk to when I don't want to talk at all. Rachel? He asked after I'd sat on his couch staring at nothing for about 20 minutes, and I nodded because that was all I could manage right then. Want to tell me about it? She's been seeing someone else for months. Called me her safety net. Said I was fine for practice but not for the real thing. Marcus made this disgusted sound that perfectly captured how I should have been feeling but somehow wasn't yet. Man, that's cold even for someone who's leaving. You okay? The thing was, I didn't know if I was okay because I couldn't feel anything except this weird hollow sensation, like someone had scooped out my insides and left me functioning on autopilot. I should have been angry or heartbroken or something, but instead I just felt empty, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart from a safe distance. I spent the weekend helping Marcus rebuild his deck, letting the physical work fill the space where emotions should have been, and by Sunday night I'd made a decision that felt more like accepting reality than choosing a path forward. Monday morning I called in sick to work and drove back to the duplex while Rachel was at her job, probably telling Harper about how well the conversation had gone and how mature I'd been about the whole thing. The house felt different already, like it belonged to someone else's life, and I moved through it collecting only what I actually needed, leaving behind everything we'd built together. The restored furniture, the matching dishes we'd picked out together, the art prints we'd had framed, all of it could stay because none of it meant the same thing anymore. I packed my clothes, my books, my certification study materials, and the toolbox my dad had given me when I moved out, loading everything into the truck bed like I was moving out of a college dorm instead of ending a 6-year relationship. The hardest part was walking past our restored dining table, remembering all the evenings we'd spent there planning our future over takeout and cheap wine, but I didn't linger because those memories belonged to people who didn't exist anymore. I left my house key on the kitchen counter next to a note that said, "Good luck with everything," which felt like the right amount of civility without pretending we were going to stay friends or that any of this mattered to me now. The apartment I found near the warehouse was small and basic, the kind of place you live in when you're starting over and don't want to think about furniture or decoration or making anything feel permanent. I unpacked my essentials, set up my computer on a folding table, and spent the evening blocking Rachel on every social media platform I could think of because I didn't want to see updates about her exciting new life with Harper or explanations about how this was all for the best. It felt good to delete her contact information, to erase the digital traces of someone who'd spent months planning to erase me from her actual life, and for the first time since Friday I felt something that might have been relief. Marcus called to check on me that night and seemed surprised that I sounded normal, maybe even better than normal. "You sure you're okay? You sound too okay for someone whose girlfriend just nuked his life." "I think maybe she did me a favor," I said, looking around my empty apartment and realizing I meant it. Turns out being someone's safety net is exhausting when you don't know that's what you are. The year after Rachel left became the most focused period of my adult life, like someone had finally turned off a background noise I hadn't realized was constantly distracting me. Without the emotional energy drain of managing someone else's ambitions and insecurities, I threw myself into my logistics certification with intensity that surprised even me. Evenings that used to be spent listening to Rachel complain about her coworkers were now dedicated to studying supply chain optimization and inventory management systems that actually excited me in ways I'd forgotten work could. It turned out I had a real aptitude for seeing inefficiencies in complex systems and figuring out elegant solutions, skills that made me valuable in ways Rachel had never bothered to notice. 6 months after my certification, I got promoted to regional logistics consultant with a substantial raise and the kind of respect from colleagues that felt completely different from being someone's financial support system. I bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood with mature oak trees and a detached garage perfect for the workshop I'd always wanted, something I could improve with my own hands without negotiating every decision with someone who saw my practical skills as limitations. Marcus suggested I start volunteering somewhere to meet people who weren't coworkers, and I ended up at the local animal shelter on Saturday mornings, helping with dog walks and maintenance tasks. The work was simple and immediately rewarding, spending time with animals who were grateful for attention without expecting me to fund their lifestyle or compare me unfavorably to someone more successful. That's where I met Lily, a veterinary technician who volunteered her professional skills on weekends and had this gentle way with nervous dogs that made even the most traumatized rescues relax around her. She was the opposite of flashy, wearing practical clothes and keeping her dark hair in a simple ponytail, but she had warm brown eyes and a laugh that felt genuine in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. Our first real conversation happened while bathing a particularly stubborn golden retriever who decided that mud was his favorite accessory, and instead of complaining about getting dirty, Lily just laughed and asked if I thought the dog was trying to make a fashion statement. We started talking about hiking after she mentioned wanting to explore more of the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it turned out we both loved the kind of quiet outdoor adventures that Rachel had always considered boring. Our relationship developed slowly over months of shared volunteer work and weekend hiking trips, building on actual compatibility instead of physical attraction and future fantasies. Lily appreciated my steady nature and practical skills, seeing my reliability as attractive rather than limiting, getting genuinely excited when I explained how I'd optimized a client's distribution network or showed her progress on my workshop renovation. "I love that you actually finish projects," she told me one evening while we were cooking dinner together, "and that you think through problems instead of just hoping they'll solve themselves." When Lily moved in after 18 months, it felt like the natural progression of something healthy rather than a milestone we were forcing. She brought her own furniture and didn't try to redesign everything I'd established, and somehow our different styles blended without conflict. The morning I proposed, we were camping at Lake Tahoe on our 2nd anniversary, sitting by the water watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and pink. I'd been carrying the ring for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment, but realized the perfect moment was just us being together somewhere beautiful. "Lily," I said, pulling the small velvet box from my jacket pocket, "will you marry me?" Her face lit up with joy that couldn't be performed or calculated, and when she said yes, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. We spent the rest of the morning talking about our actual plans, the kind of house we wanted to buy together, whether we wanted kids, how we'd combine our lives in practical ways that excited both of us. It was the complete opposite of the fantasy planning I'd done with Rachel, grounded in who we actually were rather than who we thought we should become. 3 years after Rachel walked out of my life with her designer luggage, I learned through Marcus that her upgrade hadn't worked out quite the way she'd planned. I was in my workshop on a Saturday morning, building a crib for the baby Lily and I were expecting in 4 months, when my phone rang with that particular tone Marcus uses when he has gossip he's dying to share. "You're not going to believe what I just heard about Rachel," he said without preamble, and I paused in my sanding to listen because I was curious despite myself about how the great adventure with Harper had turned out. Apparently, Harper hadn't been the successful interior designer she claimed to be, but rather a sophisticated con artist who'd been using Rachel to gain access to tech company contacts for elaborate embezzling schemes. She'd manipulated Rachel into signing contracts and financial documents under the guise of their design partnership, using Rachel's marketing connections and trusting nature to set up fraudulent business relationships with startups that Harper then systematically drained of investment capital. The FBI got involved when one of the companies figured out their seed funding had been redirected to offshore accounts. Marcus explained with a kind of detailed knowledge that meant he'd gotten the story from multiple sources. Harper disappeared overnight, left Rachel holding the bag for about $500,000 in fraudulent contracts with Rachel's signature all over them. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. Rachel had left me for someone who could offer her financial security and creative opportunities, only to discover that her sophisticated new partner was using her as a front for federal crimes. She'd lost her job when the investigation became public, lost her savings to legal fees, and was facing potential jail time for unwitting involvement in wire fraud and money laundering. "She's been trying to contact you," Marcus continued, and I could hear the concern creeping into his voice. "Called mom asking for your number, showed up at your old job looking for forwarding information. The guys at the warehouse said she seemed pretty desperate. The idea of Rachel trying to track me down after 3 years felt surreal, like hearing about someone from a movie I'd watched once and mostly forgotten. I'd moved twice since leaving the duplex, changed jobs, gotten married, and was about to become a father, while she was apparently still stuck dealing with consequences of decisions she'd made when we were together. "What did you tell her?" I asked, though I was more curious than concerned because Rachel's problems were entirely of her own making and had nothing to do with the life I'd built. "Nothing. But she knows you're married now." I might have mentioned Lily and the baby when she asked if you were doing okay. That explained the escalation Marcus described over the next few minutes. Apparently, learning that I'd moved on completely while her life was falling apart had triggered a series of increasingly frantic attempts to reach me. She tried calling from different numbers, created fake social media accounts to message me, and even attempted to friend request Lily on Instagram with a profile that claimed to be a veterinary supply company. "The whole thing's pretty pathetic," Marcus said, but I could tell he was worried about what Rachel might do next. "She kept asking if you were happy, if your wife knew about your relationship history, weird stuff like that. Like she was fishing for some kind of leverage or looking for cracks in your marriage." I set down my sandpaper and looked around the workshop I'd built, thinking about the crib I was making for my daughter and the life Lily and I had created together. Rachel's desperation felt like news from another planet, completely disconnected from anything that mattered to me now. "Let me know if she contacts you again," I told Marcus. "And if she shows up here, I'll handle it." The attempts to reach me continued sporadically over the next few weeks, always from different numbers or fake accounts that Lily and I learned to recognize and block immediately. The messages grew more manipulative as they multiplied, starting with casual, "Hey, how are you?" attempts and evolving into elaborate stories about how she'd been framed by Harper and needed help from someone who really knew her character. "I made mistakes, but you know I'm not capable of actual fraud," read one message that arrived at 2 a.m. from a number with a Nevada area code. "I keep thinking about how you always believed in people's potential to change. I could really use someone like that in my corner right now." The presumption was breathtaking, the assumption that 3 years of silence could be bridged by appealing to personality traits she'd spent 6 years taking for granted. I deleted the messages without responding because engaging with someone that desperate would only encourage more contact, and I had no interest in being pulled back into Rachel's orbit when she needed a safety net again. The final message came on a Tuesday evening while Lily and I were assembling the baby's changing table, a rambling voicemail from yet another unknown number that started with apologies and quickly devolved into barely coherent pleas for financial help with legal fees. "I know you probably hate me, but I don't have anyone else to turn to." Rachel's voice sounded hollow and strained through the phone speaker. "Harper destroyed everything, and the lawyers say I need at least $20,000 for a proper defense. You're the only person who ever really cared about me, Jake. Please, I'm begging you to call me back." Lily looked up from the instruction manual with raised eyebrows. "Should I be worried about this woman?" she asked, and I realized that despite months of blocked calls and deleted messages, I'd never properly explained to my wife just how thoroughly Rachel had burned our relationship to the ground. "Not even a little bit," I said, deleting the voicemail and blocking another number. "She made her choice a long time ago, and now she's living with the consequences." The baby shower was Lily's idea, a small gathering in our backyard with close friends and family to celebrate our daughter's upcoming arrival. We'd strung lights between the oak trees and set up tables with the kind of simple, thoughtful decorations that Lily excelled at, nothing expensive or Instagram-worthy, just warm and welcoming spaces for people who genuinely cared about us. I was manning the grill, talking with Marcus about the logistics of converting our spare room into a proper nursery, when the doorbell rang around 3 p.m. Lily was opening gifts with her sister, laughing at the tiny clothes and impossibly small shoes, so I jogged around to the front of the house expecting to find a late-arriving guest or maybe a delivery driver. Instead, I opened the door to find Rachel standing on my front porch, and the 3 years since I'd seen her had not been kind. She looked thin in a way that suggested stress rather than health, her blonde hair hanging limp around a face that seemed older and more angular than I remembered. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a rumpled sweater and jeans that looked like they'd been slept in, and her eyes had the desperate, calculating look of someone who'd run out of options. "Hi, Jake," she said, and her voice was softer than I remembered, like she was trying to sound vulnerable and non-threatening. "I know this is unexpected, but I really need to talk to you." For a moment I just stared at her, processing the surreal experience of seeing someone from my past standing in my present like a ghost that had wandered into the wrong timeline. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of our baby shower continuing, Lily's laugh carrying across the yard, friends celebrating the life we'd built together. "How did you get this address?" I asked, because that seemed like the most important question, the one that would tell me how much of a security concern Rachel represented for my family. I hired a private investigator, she said, like this was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Jake, I know you probably don't want to see me, but I'm in serious trouble and I don't have anyone else to turn to. Harper destroyed my life, and I need help from someone who actually knows who I really am. The presumption was staggering, the assumption that showing up uninvited to my baby shower was an acceptable way to reconnect after 3 years of silence. What do you want, Rachel? I asked, keeping my voice calm and my body positioned to block the doorway, because something about her energy felt unpredictable and desperate. I need money for legal fees, she said, abandoning any pretense of small talk. $20,000. I know it sounds like a lot, but given our history, what we meant to each other, I thought maybe you could help me get through this. I've been framed, Jake. Harper used me to commit crimes I never knew about, and now I'm facing prison time for things I didn't do. She stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of stale cigarettes and desperation. I've learned so much about myself over these past few years. I realize now that what we had was real, that I made a terrible mistake choosing Harper over stability and genuine love. The manipulation was so obvious it was almost insulting, the attempt to rewrite our history as some grand romance that she'd foolishly abandoned rather than the calculated upgrade she'd actually chosen. Rachel, I said, I'm married. We're having a baby. This conversation is inappropriate. I know you're married, she said quickly, but that doesn't change our history. It doesn't change the fact that you loved me for 6 years, that you supported my dreams when no one else would. Surely that means something. Surely you can't just watch me go to prison when you have the power to help. That's when Lily appeared beside me, drawn by voices at the front door, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly as she took in the scene. She was wearing the blue sundress I'd bought her for Mother's Day, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, looking radiant in the way that pregnant women do when they're truly happy. The contrast between Lily's healthy glow and Rachel's desperate pallor was stark and immediate. Hi, Lily said with the kind of polite confusion you'd use for a lost delivery driver. I'm Lily. Are you looking for someone? I put my arm around my wife's shoulders and felt the solid reality of the life we'd built together, the certainty that this was where I belonged. Rachel, this is my wife, Lily. Lily, this is Rachel, my ex-girlfriend from several years ago. Rachel's face went through a series of expressions as she processed seeing me with someone who was obviously cherished and protected, someone who represented everything she'd thrown away when she decided I wasn't good enough. She's beautiful, Rachel said, but her voice had gone flat and calculating. How far along are you? 7 months, Lily replied, instinctively stepping closer to me as she picked up on the strange energy radiating from this unexpected visitor. We're having a girl. Congratulations, Rachel said, but she was looking at me now with something that might have been panic. Jake, could we talk privately for just a few minutes? There are things about our relationship that your wife probably doesn't know, things that might be important for her to understand. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, the suggestion that she had information that could damage my marriage, and I felt something cold and protective settle in my chest. Actually, I said, tightening my grip on Lily's hand, my wife knows everything important about my past, including the fact that you called me your safety net and said I was fine for practice but not for the real thing. Lily's eyebrows rose slightly, but she squeezed my hand supportively. Rachel's face flushed red as her attempt at leverage evaporated. That's not fair. I was young and confused and scared. I made mistakes, but I never stopped caring about you. We could work this out, Jake. I could be part of your life again, maybe help with a baby. I've learned so much about what really matters. The delusion was complete now, the fantasy that she could somehow insert herself back into my life as if the past 3 years hadn't happened, as if I hadn't built something infinitely better without her. Rachel, I said firmly, Lily is my first choice in everything. Not my safety net, not my backup plan, not my practice relationship. My first choice. And our problems are consequences of decisions you made. I'm not responsible for fixing your life. That's when she snapped. You can't just abandon me, she shouted, loud enough that I heard conversation in the backyard pause. After everything I meant to you, after 6 years together, you can't just watch me lose everything. She tried to push past me into the house, but I stepped firmly into the doorway and held my ground. You need to leave, I said calmly. This is my home, my family, and you're not welcome here. I'm not leaving until you agree to help me. Rachel screamed, her desperation finally showing its true face. You owe me at least that much. I gently moved Lily behind me and stepped outside, closing the front door firmly behind me to protect my pregnant wife from whatever scene was about to unfold. I don't owe you anything, I said quietly, but I am calling the police to report trespassing. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 while Rachel stared at me in disbelief, probably realizing for the first time that her last connection to her old life was truly severed. By the time the officers arrived 10 minutes later, she was sitting on the curb crying, all the fight drained out of her. I gave a brief statement about unwanted contact and trespassing, and watched as they drove her away from my life for what I knew would be the final time. Back in the yard, our guests were pretending nothing had happened, but Lily pulled me aside as soon as I returned. "Are you okay?" she asked, searching my face for signs of lingering attachment or regret. "I'm perfect," I said, and meant it completely. She reminded me how lucky I am to have found someone who chose me first.